Welcome to exercise 4. We are now in module 4 of our course, and we're almost halfway done with the semester, which is very exciting. So today, or in this exercise, we're going to be talking about raw image files, and we're going to work on this provided file in particular. So you will be able to just click a link really easily from Canvas and download this file, which is labeled exercise4.cr2. And you can see in my little preview of details on the right, this is a Canon camera raw file. So if you are a photographer using a professional quality DSLR camera, or perhaps you've worked with a photographer or just sort of been curious about this, you might be somewhat familiar with these types of files. But this is an important one to learn, especially for those of you that are getting into the photography field, or even from the design side, the art direction side. You might be working with raw images in some way, especially when you're working with professional photographers. So what a raw file type is basically just an uncompressed image in its best quality that we have available currently. So they are typically pretty large files. You can see here this is almost 25 megabytes. That's much larger than your typical JPEG file. Definitely larger from a JPEG that you would download from your iPhone, for example. But the idea is that through taking images with your DSLR camera in RAW, that lens, that camera is able to interpret what it's seeing in real life in the highest quality possible. It's able to take in a larger spectrum of color and detail than you would get from a more traditional or basic camera on your phone, for example. And in Photoshop, you have some specific tools that you can use within the sort of raw mode that Photoshop has available. So to get started with this exercise, as I mentioned, you'll just download this exercise file. We're all going to be working with the same file on this exercise, just like we've done previously. And to open this, you can simply drag and open it into Photoshop, as I just did. And I'll just hit cancel to show you another option. You can also go to File, Open, and then you can find the file that way. So it's up to you, whatever is easier. You can even right click and open it in Photoshop from your Finder window or File Explorer in PC. But the important thing to remember here is that we are not creating a new file. We're just opening an existing image. We're opening this raw file. And you can see that this looks very different when we open this. You get an entirely different modal or screen here in Photoshop, and you can see at the top it says Camera Raw. This is Photoshop's provided Camera Raw editor. So it's always going to open like this when you open up a raw file. It will give you a different set of options. You can, of course, edit the photo directly in Photoshop. So you could just hit open from here and edit in Photoshop. We're not going to be doing that for this exercise because we want to show you some of the options that we have available. And some of this stuff will look pretty familiar to you because it's very similar to some of those like adjustment layers that we've been learning in Photoshop so far. So it shouldn't be completely unfamiliar, but it's a different set of tools because basically what this is doing is applying these adjustments and saving them as metadata in your photo. So Camera Raw has the ability to hold a lot of data within it. That just kind of gives you some more flexibility as you edit your photos. And once again, this is a little bit more advanced. This is more so for professional photography. So if you do have a DSLR camera at home and you're interested in trying this out, this is a great tool. But this is a great exercise for all of us to learn. And once again, a lot of these tools in the Camera Raw editor here are going to be somewhat familiar or repeated in other areas of Photoshop. So even if you're not using Camera Raw files really often, I actually do not in my line of work currently, but I think it's still a really great set of tools to learn and just to kind of familiarize yourself with Camera Raw files in case that does come up at some point in your career. Okay, so we've opened the raw image. And you can see when you open it, this basic label drop down might be open. If it's not, you can go ahead and open it. You can also just toggle any of these other menus open and closed if you want to sort of explore what they do. But we're going to start with basic, and you can follow along closely to mine. I think most people are going to have some edits that are very close to my example, but feel free to explore a little bit as you work on this. But the one thing I will note is if you are drastically changing things in this image, for example, you're drastically, changing the overall temperature or color balance to be really purple or something like that in this image. If you do something that's really drastically different from this example, I would love for you to explain a little bit of why you did that in the discussion board turn-in. So just be mindful of that. If you're doing something really different than this, I will definitely require you to kind of give me a little bit of explanation. And if I have questions, I'll ask them in the discussion board as well. But we're going to start by editing what's called the white balance. So this is under this basic set of options that we've opened up. And white balance is used in photography to establish sort of the true shade of white in the image. So what that does is help kind of balance the color overall, because you're telling the image, for this example, we're going to be telling the image that this light switch is the whitest part of the image. Even though there's some sort of brighter areas, these are sort of blown out areas. We're trying to pick the whitest spot in this room. And what that's going to do is adjust the rest of the colors to sort of mimic the lighting of that white spot and make things look as natural as possible. So it's going to, in this case, make it look like this scene was taken in daylight and give it the most realistic color balance and lighting possible. And this is going to be a pretty subtle change here, but we're going to test this out. So where it says white balance, you can see it says add shot. Just leave that as is, and then select this little eyedropper tool, and you're going to pinpoint on a white area of this image, which will likely be like this door trim or the outlet. Most of you will probably just want to use the outlet. And hopefully you can see that made a very subtle adjustment to the overall color in the image. So once again, that's a pretty subtle one, but we want to adjust the white balance in this image. And that's always something you can do in photography. If you are a professional photographer, you might actually be photographing like a white card in the studio, for example, to make sure that you have a reference point for your white balance. And next we are going to adjust the temperature and the tint here. And you can see if I play around with temperature, you can see obviously if I drag this all the way down to the blue, it's taking the overall temperature, sort of that color tone of the image, much cooler. So I'm just doing this really drastically so you can see the difference. But we are going to adjust this to about 5400. So I just sort of warmed it up just a little bit. So about there. I think tint will probably leave as is, but you can see once you start messing with tint, once again, you're adjusting the overall tint or color balance in the photo. So you can adjust it to sort of a magenta tone or this overall greenish tone. And these are sort of similar to that color balance adjustment layer. Maybe we'll leave this around +3 or so. So you want numbers probably around there, but again, feel free to play. If you go entirely blue, I just want to know why and why you think that improves the overall quality of the image. And now we're going to take a look at exposure. And exposure in photography, in sort of the simplest term that I can come up with, is the amount of light that reaches the camera lens when you're photographing. So even more simply than that, this particular setting would be adjusting the overall lightness and darkness of your image. So you can see as I pull this up, it's overexposing the image and making it really blown out and far too light, or I can really underexpose the image and darken it quite a bit. So we're only going to adjust this a tiny, tiny bit from where it should have started at 0. So we're just adjusting this to 0.7 0.7, close to 0.7, somewhere around there. So we're just bringing the exposure up a little bit. Just sort of making sure that our foreground is a little bit lighter here. And now we're going to take a look at highlights. Once again, you can play around with contrast. Feel free to just sort of mess around with these toggles. You can always bring them back to the middle or just type in a 0 to take things back to where you started. Highlights, we're going to bring down a little bit because we do have some blown out areas of this image. We're going to bring highlights all the way down to the left at -100. And then shadows, which is similar to highlights, it's affecting the darkest parts of the image or the shadows. We're gonna bring those up a little bit because we're trying to lighten some of this dark area in the image in the foreground here. So we're gonna bring shadows up to around +20 here. And then the whites, we are also going to bring up a little bit just to kind of make this look white and bright. So maybe around 50, +50 there for whites. All right, then we're gonna take a look at clarity. And you can see as you play around with clarity, if you bring this all the way down, it's going to sort of blur the image. This is sort of affecting the overall sharpness of the pixels in your image. So you can see if I bring this all the way up, it can be very, very sharp. And it's almost sort of looking like a more high contrasted, sharp pixeled image is the best way I can explain it. We don't want to go quite this far up. I think we'll take it to about 30. So you'll see +30 there, and that's clarity. And those are, well, actually we'll adjust vibrance as well. And then this will be the final tool that we're going to adjust for this exercise. So vibrance is sort of similar to saturation. It's increasing kind of the lightness and the vibrancy of the colors in the image. We're going to bring this up to around 30. And just to show you, you can also play with saturation, but I think we're going to leave that as is. I'm just going to type in 0 there to take saturation back to the center. So those are all of the updates that we're going to be making for this exercise within this basic options area. So now I'm just going to click that little arrow and close basic. And now we're going to mess around with something called color grading. And this is can be a very complex tool. This is actually a career path for a lot of people, especially in the film industry. So don't worry if this seems really, really advanced, because it is for me too. This is something that I am definitely not an expert on, but we're going to play around with it just a little bit. So you can see with color grading, you have these 3 color wheels that are affecting the midtones of the image, the shadows, and the highlights. And this should be somewhat familiar. Maybe from the levels adjustment layer, you can sort of see how you can adjust overall midtones, shadows, and highlights in your image. But unlike levels, this is adjusting the color in all of those areas of darkness and lightness in the image. So we're gonna warm up the midtones just slightly. And you can see if I really drag this out. So I just started in the center here, and I'm just very, very subtly dragging this a little bit off center until I see this sort of little orange circle here. So I'm just warming up the midtones just very subtly. So you can see initially I dragged it out completely just to show you a drastic difference. But for this actual exercise, we're just going to drag this out very, very subtly. And then for shadows, we're actually going to cool those down a little bit, and we're just going to drag this until we see a little purple circle. And you can see I just barely dragged that circle to just below the center. So I'm just cooling the shadows just a little bit. And then highlights, we're going to take just a tiny bit into the green area here, just to sort of help emphasize the plants and some of the greener areas that are highlighted in the image. So once again, this should be a pretty subtle adjustment that you're making. And that's all we're going to do for color grading. So we're just going to close that. Then we are going to take a look at curve here. And this should be, it's definitely a different interface, but it should be somewhat familiar if you've been messing around with the curves adjustment layer in Photoshop. So rather than messing around with the actual curve here, we're just going to use the toggles and we're going to bring the highlights down quite a bit. Maybe around 50 or 55. So negative 55 there. And then the lights are just going to be the lightest area of the image after those really bright highlights. I think we're actually going to bring those up a little bit to kind of emphasize the light colors in the room, around plus 20. And then the darks, we're going to bring up a lot because this image is overall very, very dark. So we're going to bring darks up to plus 60. And then once again, I'm just drastically doing this to see the difference. I think shadows will just bring up about plus 5 or plus 6. So pretty subtle there with the shadows. So that is our curves adjustment. Then we are also going to take a look at detail. And we've already increased the clarity of this image, which is affecting the kind of sharpness or detail of the pixels here. So we don't want to go too crazy with this. We're going to put sharpening at about 25. You might not see a huge adjustment here, but that's okay. And now we're going to open up this menu that says Optics. And just to show you what that's going to do here, so let's just zoom in on this image quite a bit. I'm going to zoom into the window just to show you this chromatic aberration that's happening. That's what this is called in Photoshop. You can see this sort of neon effect that we're getting in the window here because the lighting is so bright and blown out. We're going to use an automated tool within Optics for Photoshop. So you're just going to check this box that says remove chromatic aberration. And you can see as I toggle this on and off, it's just reducing that neon pixels in the image that we're getting from the light bouncing off. So you'll just check on remove chromatic aberration. All right. And now I'm just going to go back to the bottom here, zoom, I'm going to click fit in view just so I can see this image once again. And you can click at the bottom here to sort of see the before and after of all of those adjustments that you made. So you can see we started off with a pretty dark image. We of course improved the overall lightness in the image. We played around with the overall color balance and sharpness, just to sort of really improve the quality of this image and make it feel like a light and bright room and like a beautiful image that might be used in real estate or printed in a magazine, for example. So we really want to emphasize the lightness of the room, the colors, emphasize the colors, especially in the furniture. So you can always think about the objects in your image and what you're really trying to emphasize, especially, you know, say you're selling a couch or something and you really want to emphasize the beautiful color of it that you think is important for the sale, for example. So you can always be thinking about what you're trying to do with your image in selecting the types of edits that you're going to apply. All right, so now we are just going to hit open in the bottom right here, and that's going to open this file with all of these adjustments made in Photoshop. So you can see now we have just the after image, and it's now opened as a background layer in Photoshop. And we're just gonna make a few more edits on top of this before we turn in this exercise. So the first thing we're gonna do is just click and drag this layer to the little plus icon to duplicate it. And then we're gonna double click and just rename this edits, because we're gonna be making a few edits to the image that we just wanna save on a separate layer. So the first thing we're gonna do is play around with the patch tool. And the patch tool you can see is sort of towards the top in the toolbar. And one thing I wanted to mention is sometimes people are moving these tools around. I think I mentioned on the first exercise that Photoshop's very customizable, where you can always move windows and tools around. So if you're not seeing this, it could be hidden under one of these other tools. Just hit J on your keyboard and then click and hold the menu and make sure you have patch tool selected. If you're not seeing any of those tools, you can always go back to this little icon that I'm hovering over in the top right, and it says choose a workspace. When you hover over that, you can click that, and I always use the Essentials workspace, but you can just hit Reset Essentials, and it's just gonna reset all of your panels and tools back to this Essentials workspace, which is what most of us are probably working in. So if you're not seeing something, you can always go back to the top right and just hit Reset Essentials just to make sure you've got the right tools available. So once again, that's J on the keyboard for the patch tool. The icon looks like a literal patch that you'd sew on a pair of jeans or something. And what we're going to be doing is just patching or adjusting the pixels of this turned up area of the rug. So something like this is definitely something we would want to edit out in an image, especially if this were for real estate or something. You don't want to show, you know, a rug that's turned up that has sort of a mistake in the image. So making sure in the options panel that you have this selected. This should be default, it says new selection. And then just make sure normal is selected in this little drop down next to patch. And now we're just gonna click and drag to make a little selection. It's pretty similar to the lasso tool, and we basically just drew a little circle or a little lasso around this turned up area of the rug. And now what we're gonna do is within this selection, we're just gonna click and drag around and just start dragging. You don't wanna let go of the mouse quite yet, but you're sort of just looking for an area of the rug that you will essentially patch over this turned up area. So find a part of the rug that feels like it's going to sort of align. So I think it's gonna have to be this little bump out here, and then let go, and you can see it's kind of used some pixels from this part of the rug to patch over that area and give you a flatter part of the rug. So we're just patching to remove that turned up area in the rug. And that is looking pretty good, but feel free to keep exploring with this tool. And once again, this is why we duplicated the layer here, so that we can keep this edit on a separate layer so that you can always go back to your original. And I'm just gonna hit Command D to deselect that area. It's not perfect, but I'll let you guys figure out if you want to explore some tools to make that look really perfect. All right, next thing we're gonna do is mess around with some content aware to remove things in the image really quickly and easily. So you can see we've got like a little outlet here, we've got the light switch here. Sometimes, especially like in real estate photography, you might want to remove these things because they can feel sort of distracting to the image. Or in the case of this outlet here, you know, it's sort of got like a tangency with the table that maybe isn't the most visually pleasing thing. So we're going to do a couple of different tools to remove these things. The first thing we're going to do is remove this outlet. We're going to zoom in on it a little bit. And we're gonna grab the marquee tool from the toolbar. It's just that little rectangle, should be second in the toolbar. And we're just gonna make a little rectangle pretty roughly, sorry, didn't mean to move it, just around this outlet. And then what we're going to do with that selection made is we're going to go to Edit and then Content Aware Fill. And it opens up this little preview menu here. And you can see on the right, we have the preview of what the Content Aware Fill will actually do to the image, which looks pretty good. On the left, you have your original image with that selection that you made, and then it has this green area that's basically showing the pixels that Photoshop is pulling from in order to remove. So I think because I've already done this, it's actually looking a lot closer than when I did this before. But in case this is not looking quite right, which you can see if I really zoom in here, this edge of the table is a little bit mismatched. So you can use this brush tool that should be automatically selected to either remove or add pixels that Photoshop is essentially using to replace the pixels of what you are trying to erase here. So you can see how the more I remove, it's kind of adjusting this. This might not be what I want. I'm gonna hit this little plus icon that I'm hovering over because I wanna add in some more pixels. So you're gonna have to play with this a little bit. Maybe I need to remove this. Nope, I just did a Command Z. So it's not perfect. You can keep messing around with this, but for the sake of keeping this video short, I'm gonna leave this as is. And I'm going to hit OK. And you can either hit OK or apply. You can see hitting OK actually adds this as a new fill layer, which is kind of nice because then I can adjust it if I wish. I could even add a mask here to sort of try to improve the alignment on the table there. So I'll leave that up to you guys. Another thing we're gonna do, this one should probably be quicker because removing this outlet or this light switch, sorry, it has less interaction with things around it. So I think this one should remove pretty easily. And we're going to do the same thing. We're just gonna hit M for marquee. We're gonna do a little marquee pretty roughly around this light switch. And then from here, we could actually just right click and hit fill, or you can also go to edit fill. So make your selection with the marquee and then select fill either from right clicking or the edit menu. And this is doing a similar thing. It's also using what's called content aware in Photoshop, basically using other pixels to fill in areas in order to remove things. But this is sort of a quicker, less customizable way to do it. So you're gonna get this little window here. Just make sure that content aware is selected. Actually, I'm just realizing I need to make sure when I do this that I'm actually on this edits layer. Sorry about that. So once again, fill, content aware, then hit OK, and you can see that that just very quickly removed that and filled it with pixels from this wall. Now I've just done a fit to screen so we can see the overall image, and it's pretty good. I mean, there's some refinement that could happen with the rug and the content aware that we did around the table, but it looks pretty good. And that's all you're going to be doing for this exercise. Once again, if you do want to go further than this, if you're making some more adjustments in RAW, or maybe patching some other areas of the image, or using any of the other tools that you've learned so far, just be sure to tell us why you are doing those things and how those tools or those adjustments that you've made improve the quality of this image. So make sure to tell us that in the discussion board if you are doing these things. And you can see now we have 3 layers. You'll either have 2 or 3 layers depending on what exactly you've done. And for this exercise, you are just going to be turning in the web-sized file for this image. So you're going to keep the raw file or save, you're actually going to make sure you save your PSD file so that you have a copy of it. So just go to File, Save As, just using the naming conventions that I've been using for everything else in the class. This is exercise 4. So I just saved my PSD file, and I'm just asking that you export a web-sized JPEG for the discussion board for this exercise. So now that I've saved the PSD, I'm going to go to File, Export, then Save for Web. You can also do Export As, but I prefer Save for Web because it compresses it a little bit more. And you should all be pretty familiar with this. There's of course that saving video that you can reference at any time. But for uploading to discussion boards on Canvas, we always want to change the longest edge of the image, which in this case is the width. We're going to change it to 1920 pixels. So in the end, your JPEG will be 1920 pixels wide by 1280 pixels high. And you will hit save. Add a little underscore web at the end, just making sure I'm saving this in the right place. And that's it for this exercise. So we've learned how to edit raw image types in Photoshop, as well as content aware and patch tools, which should be really helpful with any types of retouching that you'll do on any type of image type, including JPEGs. So I hope you've enjoyed this exercise, and happy retouching and exploring.